Fleet Commander Urath Soma stood on the bridge of the Axiom of Silence and stared at something that should not exist. The dreadnought was the size of a small moon, and it had seen 1,000 battles across 3 centuries of service to the Velhari Dominion. But nothing in its long history had prepared its commander for what now filled the observation screen. A wound in space. That was the only way Urath could describe it, and even that felt wrong because wounds implied something that could heal, and this thing was growing. The anomaly had appeared 6 rotations ago in the Orion Spur without warning and without explanation, and it had been expanding ever since, and the latest scans showed it now stretched across 4 light-years of open space folding and twisting reality like fabric caught in a storm. Urath pressed his 4-fingered hand against the console and pulled up the data again, hoping the numbers had changed, but they had not, and the projection was clear and brutal and absolute. 17 inhabited systems would be consumed within 40 rotations. He closed his eyes and let the weight of that number settle into his bones, and then he opened a channel to the conquered High Council, because there was nothing else to do. The emergency session convened aboard the Grand Conclave Station at the heart of conquered space, and representatives from 42 species filled the vast circular chamber, each one speaking over the others in a rising tide of panic and accusation. The Torathi delegate slammed his fist against his lectern and demanded immediate evacuation of his homeworld, which sat directly in the projected path of expansion. The Salii ambassador wept openly because her species had no faster-than-light capability of their own and relied entirely on conquered transport lanes that were already buckling under the spatial distortion. The Velhari delegation stood tall and silent, and proud as they always did, but Urath could see the tension in their shoulders, and the tight set of their jaws because pride was a poor shield against the unknown. Speaker after speaker rose to offer theories, and each one was shot down within minutes. The rift, as they were now calling it, did not behave like any known phenomenon, and it was not a black hole because it did not consume matter in the traditional sense, and it was not a wormhole because it led nowhere, and it was not a dimensional breach because the readings did not match any model in the conquered scientific database. What it appeared to be doing was folding spacetime backward on itself, creating recursive temporal loops within its boundaries, and ships that had been sent to investigate had simply vanished, not destroyed, but displaced, flung to random points in the past or future with no way to return. 3 exploration vessels and their crews were already gone. The greatest scientists of the conquered stood before the assembly and admitted with visible shame that they did not understand what the rift was, or where it had come from, or how to stop it. Urath watched them and felt something he had not felt in decades of military service. He felt afraid. And then the High Speaker, a towering Dreleshi matriarch with silver scales and ancient eyes, turned to the far corner of the chamber, where the smallest delegation sat. The humans. There were only 3 of them, and they occupied a space meant for 12, and they had not spoken once during the entire session, and Urath had almost forgotten they were there, because that was easy to do with humans. They were the youngest species in the conquered by a factor of 9, and they had only been part of the alliance for 60 years, and most of the elder species still treated them like children who had wandered into a room full of adults. Ambassador Lena Vasquez was a small woman with dark hair pulled back from a face that gave away nothing, and she sat with her hands folded on the table, and her eyes fixed on the holographic display of the rift rotating slowly in the center of the chamber. The High Speaker addressed her with the careful politeness that elder species reserved for those they considered beneath their notice. Does the human delegation wish to contribute? The chamber quieted, not out of respect, but out of mild curiosity, the way one might watch a pet perform an unexpected trick. Lena Vasquez stood, and she was not tall, and her voice was not loud, But when she spoke, every translator in the room carried her words with perfect clarity. We have seen this before. The silence that followed was not the polite silence of before. It was the silence of 42 species, simultaneously trying to process a statement that made no sense. The Torathi delegate leaned forward, and his expression shifted from grief to suspicion in the span of a heartbeat. "Impossible," he said, and his voice cracked like breaking stone. The Salii ambassador stopped crying and stared. Ureth felt his hands tight on the railing in front of him. High Speaker Dreleshi tilted her massive head, and her silver scales caught the light. "Explain," she said. Lena Vasquez looked around the chamber at all the ancient and powerful species who had built empires that spanned galaxies and who had existed for tens of thousands of years, and who were now staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. She did not smile, and she did not flinch, and she said it again with the calm certainty of someone stating that water was wet. "We have seen this before, and we know how it ends." The chamber erupted, and voices from every corner shouted questions and accusations and demands for proof, and Ureth could barely hear himself think over the noise. He turned to his aide and ordered a full intelligence poll on the human species. The file arrived in seconds, and it was classified and restricted, and barely 2 pages long because nobody in the Velhari intelligence apparatus had ever considered humans worth studying in depth. He scrolled through it quickly, and the details were unremarkable, and the humans had moderate technology and a small fleet and limited territorial holdings, and a species lifespan that was almost embarrassingly short by galactic standards. And then he reached the bottom of the second page, and a footnote caught his eye. It read, "Species demonstrates unusual cultural fixation on hypothetical extinction events," and it referenced something called the Fiction Archives with a note that said, "See attached cultural analysis if available." There was no attached analysis. Nobody had ever bothered to write one. Ureth looked up from his screen, and across the chamber Ambassador Vasquez was still standing and still calm, and still waiting for the noise to die down. And for the first time in his long career, Fleet Commander Ureth Soma of the Velhari Dominion looked at a human and felt something he could not name. It was not respect exactly. It was closer to the feeling he got when he realized an enemy had been in position long before the battle began. It was the cold, sharp recognition that he had underestimated something, and that the mistake might matter more than he could imagine. The High Speaker finally restored order, and the chamber fell silent once more, and Lena Vasquez still stood there small and quiet and absolutely certain. She said 3 more words. "Let us help." And the galaxy held its breath. Ureth did not trust humans, and he made no effort to hide it. The conquered High Council had assigned him to work alongside a human tactical team aboard the UENS Cassandra, and he had accepted the order because he was a soldier and soldiers followed orders, but he had not accepted the premise behind it. The idea that the youngest and weakest species in the galaxy had somehow already encountered a phenomenon that baffled every elder civilization was either a lie or a trap, and Ureth intended to find out which. The Cassandra was a mid-class cruiser, and it was small by Velhari standards, barely larger than one of his escort frigates, but it was clean and well-maintained, and its crew moved through its corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that Ureth recognized from his own best officers. Captain Darius Mwangi met him at the docking port, and he was a tall man with dark skin and steady eyes, and a handshake that was firmer than Ureth expected from a species with only 5 fingers. "Welcome aboard, Commander," Darius said, and his voice carried a warmth that felt genuine, which made Ureth trust him even less. They gave him quarters, and they gave him access to the ship's common areas, and they gave him a seat at the tactical table, and they did not treat him like a spy, even though they both knew that was part of his mission. On the second day, Ureth decided to stop circling the question and ask it directly. He found Darius in the ship's small briefing room, reviewing sensor data from the rift, and he sat down across from him and folded all four of his arms and said what he had been thinking since the moment Ambassador Vasquez opened her mouth. "How did you know?" Darius looked at him for a long moment, and then he leaned back in his chair and said something that Ureth did not expect. He said, "I will show you." What followed was the strangest briefing of Ureth's military career. Darius led him to a section of the ship's database that was not classified and not restricted and not hidden in any way, and in fact, it was available to any crew member who wanted it. It was called the Fiction Archives. Ureth had seen the footnote in the intelligence file, and he had assumed it was some minor cultural database of myths or religious texts, but what he found was something else entirely. It was enormous. Thousands upon thousands of stories written by humans over a span of centuries, and they were not histories, and they were not prophecies, and they were not scientific papers. They were made up. Humans had a word for it that Ureth's translator struggled with at first. Fiction. Stories that were not true, but were written as if they were, and Ureth could not understand why any species would waste time creating detailed accounts of events that never happened. Darius explained it to him with the patience of someone who had given this explanation before. Humans write stories about the future, he said, and not because we know what the future holds, but because we cannot stop imagining what it might hold, and we have been doing this for as long as we have had language. He pulled up a category within the archives labeled speculative fiction, and the subcategories went on and on and on. Stories about alien invasions and stories about plagues that wiped out civilizations and stories about machines that turned against their creators and stories about stars that died and planets that froze and black holes that swallowed everything and time that broke and reality that shattered and dimensions that bled into each other. Millions of stories written by millions of humans across hundreds of years, all asking the same question. What if the worst thing we can imagine actually happens? And then trying to answer it. Ureth scrolled through the database in silence, and the scale of it pressed against his mind like a physical weight, because no species in the Conquered had anything like this. The Velhari had war histories and tactical manuals, and the Torathi had philosophical treatises, and the Salii had songs of harmony, and the Dreleshi had meditative archives stretching back 50,000 years. But none of them had this. None of them had spent centuries deliberately imagining every possible way the universe could destroy them, and then writing detailed accounts of how to survive it. Darius watched him scroll, and then he said the thing that changed everything. He opened one specific file, and it was a novel written in the year 2031 by a human author named Priya Chandrasekharan, and the title was The Recursion Tide, and it had been a modest success when it was published, selling perhaps 50,000 copies before fading into obscurity. The novel described a spatial anomaly that appeared without warning in an inhabited region of space, and the anomaly folded spacetime backward on itself, creating recursive temporal loops, and it consumed star systems by erasing them from the timeline, and it could not be stopped by any conventional means. Ureth read the summary, and his blood went cold. The description matched the convergence rift almost exactly. Not approximately, and not loosely, and not in the way that a vague prediction might accidentally align with reality. The geometric pattern of expansion was the same, and the temporal recursion signature was the same, and the effect on surrounding space-time was the same. A human woman sitting in a small apartment 356 years ago had written a story about the exact thing that was now threatening to consume 17 star systems. Ureth stood up and his chair scraped against the floor, and his voice came out harder than he intended. "You knew," he said, and his accusation was clear. Darius did not flinch. "No," he said, and he said it simply and without defense. We did not predict this, and we did not cause this, and Priya Chandrasekharan was not a prophet, and she was not a time traveler, and she was not working from classified intelligence. She was a 26-year-old woman who liked physics and had a good imagination, and she wrote a book. Urath shook his head because the coincidence was too precise and too convenient. Darius leaned forward, and his eyes were serious and tired, and honest in a way that Urath could not deny. Commander, he said, you are looking at one novel out of millions. And yes, this one happens to match what we are facing right now. But there are novels in that archive that describe every other possible catastrophe too, and most of them will never happen, and we know that. We did not predict the rift. We predicted everything. Millions of humans spent centuries imagining every possible way the universe could kill us, and you are looking at the one time the universe picked a scenario we had already written down. The silence between them stretched, and Urath could hear the hum of the ship around them, and he wanted to argue, but the math was hard to deny. Because if you imagined enough catastrophes, sooner or later reality would match one of them. And then Darius said the part that mattered most. The novel did not just describe the problem, he said. It described a solution. At that same hour in the Concord Council chamber, the greatest minds of 42 species presented their final analysis, and it was grim. Every countermeasure they had tried in simulation had failed, and gravitational dampeners had no effect, and warp field inversion made the rift expand faster, and dimensional shielding crumbled on contact, and they had nothing left. Ambassador Lena Vasquez rose from her seat and walked to the center of the chamber, and she activated a holographic display that showed not a scientific model but a page from a novel. She presented the solution described in the recursion tide, and she laid it out step by step, and the alien commanders stared at her with expressions that ranged from disbelief to horror. She looked at them all, and she did not apologize, and she did not hedge, and she said it plainly. The author got the problem right. We believe she got the solution right too. And for the second time, the galaxy held its breath. The plan was insane. Urath understood this within the first 10 minutes of the briefing, and so did every Concord strategist in the room, and so did the humans who proposed it, and that last part was what bothered him the most. They knew it was insane, and they wanted to do it anyway. The novel The Recursion Tide had proposed that a recursive anomaly could only be collapsed from within, and the method was something the author had called a counter-recursive signal, which in simple terms meant creating a mirror paradox inside the rift. The idea was to send a ship into the anomaly carrying a device that could generate a stable temporal loop, and the loop would feed the rift a version of its own endpoint, a picture of its own collapse, and the paradox created by showing the rift its own death would force it to resolve and fold inward on itself. A closed loop fired like a bullet into the heart of a wound in space. The Torathi chief scientist called it theoretical nonsense. The Salii Physics Council called it philosophically offensive. The Velhari Strategic Command called it a waste of a good ship. And the Dreleshi High Speaker listened to all of them, and then turned to the humans and asked the only question that mattered. Can you build it? Darius Mwangi stood before the assembly, and he was honest in a way that made Urath uncomfortable, because military officers were not supposed to be honest in briefings, and they were supposed to project certainty even when they had none. We do not have this technology, Darius said, and no one does, because no species in the Concord has ever built a stable temporal loop drive. He paused, and the chamber waited. But we have thought about it, he said, and we have thought about it a lot. He explained that human scientists and human writers had been theorizing about temporal mechanics for centuries, not because they had any practical need for it, but because the idea fascinated them, and because humans could not encounter an interesting problem without trying to solve it, even if the problem was entirely imaginary. Between hard science fiction novels and academic thought experiments and theoretical physics papers, written purely for intellectual enjoyment, human civilization had produced 17 different theoretical frameworks for generating a stable temporal loop. Most of them were incomplete or contradictory, or based on assumptions that could not be tested. But 3 of them were viable. 3 theoretical models developed by humans who were simply curious could be adapted to work with existing conquered hardware, if that hardware was modified according to spec. Ifications that a physicist named Dr. Amara Osa had been developing in her spare time for the last 11 years. She had started the work as a hobby. She had continued it because she found it interesting. She had never expected anyone to actually need it. The conquered engineers were skeptical, and Urath could see it in the way. They studied the human proposals with expressions that mixed professional curiosity with barely concealed condescension. The Velhari chief engineer, a brilliant and rigid woman named Thenra, examined Dr. Osai's specifications for 2 full days, and at the end of those 2 days, she came to Urath and her expression had changed. The math works, she said, and she sounded almost offended by this fact. It should not work because the underlying theory is built on assumptions that no serious conquered scientist would make, but the assumptions are internally consistent, and the math is elegant, and the projected output is exactly what we need. She paused, and her mandibles clicked in the way that meant she was processing something difficult. These humans, she said, they did not build this from rigorous first principles the way we would have, and they did not derive it from observed phenomena the way the Torathi would have. They imagined it. They sat in rooms and asked what if, and they followed the questions wherever they led, and they wrote it down, and somehow they arrived at a viable solution to a problem that did not exist yet. Urath asked her if she could build the device, and she said yes if the humans helped because the theory was theirs, and she did not fully understand the intuitive leaps they had made even though the math supported them. The construction began immediately. A joint fleet assembled around the Cassandra, and engineers from 7 species worked in shifts around the clock, and the work was difficult and dangerous, and unlike anything any of them had attempted before. Urath watched the humans work, and he began to see something that he had missed before. They were not smarter than the elder species, and they were not more disciplined, and they were not more skilled, and in many cases the conquered engineers were faster and more precise. But the humans had something else. They had comfort with the unknown. When a problem arose that had no precedent, the conquered engineers would stop and consult their databases and search for analogous situations in their vast recorded histories. And if no analogy existed, they would become uncertain and slow. The humans would look at each other, and someone would say, "What if we try this?" And they would try it. And if it failed, they would try something else. And they moved through uncertainty the way fish moved through water because they had been swimming in it, their entire existence as a species. Urath stood on the observation deck one evening and watched the modified Cassandra floating in the construction cradle with cables and conduits running from it in every direction, and he tried to understand what he was feeling. It was not admiration exactly, although there was some of that. It was the slow dawning recognition that he had been wrong about something fundamental. Every elder species in the conquered had survived and thrived by building systems of knowledge and stability and order, and they had cataloged the universe, and they had mastered its laws, and they had constructed civilizations that endured for millennia. And then something came along that was not in any catalog, and not described by any law, and not accounted for in any system, and every one of those ancient civilizations was paralyzed. And the humans were not. Because humans had never had the luxury of certainty, and their entire history was a series of encounters with the unknown, and they had faced plagues they did not understand and natural disasters they could not predict, and wars that erupted from causes they did not see coming, and through all of it, they had survived not by knowing what was coming, but by being ready for anything. The fiction was not a quirk, and it was not a hobby, and it was not a cultural oddity. It was training. Every novel was a simulation, and every story was a war game, and every human child who had ever stayed up late reading about alien invasions or time travel or the end of the world had been doing something that no other species in the galaxy had thought to do. They had been practicing. On the final day of construction, Dr. Ose ran the first test of the temporal loop drive, and the entire fleet held position and watched. The Cassandra powered up the device, and for 0.3 of a second the ship flickered, and the sensors recorded something impossible. A transmission from the Cassandra arrived at the fleet communication array, and the timestamp showed it had been sent 12 hours in the future. The message contained one word: faster. Darius read the message, and his face went tight and pale, and he turned to his crew and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "We need to move," and nobody asked why, because the message was from themselves, and they had not sent it yet, and that meant something was coming. And they trusted themselves enough to listen. The fleet began final preparations, and the rift continued to grow, and somewhere in the vast archives of human fiction, a 300-year-old novel waited to find out if its ending was right. The first system was consumed on a Tuesday by human reckoning, and Urath would remember that detail for the rest of his life, because it seemed wrong that the erasure of 2 billion souls should happen on a day with such an ordinary name. The Torathi homeworld of Vareth Prime sat in the direct path of the rift, and the evacuation had been underway for days, but the rift accelerated faster than the projections, and the last transport ships were still loading when the edge of the anomaly reached the outer atmosphere. There was no explosion, and there was no fire, and there was no sound. The planet simply stopped existing. One moment Vareth Prime was there with its green oceans, and its amber cities, and its 2 billion people, and the next moment it was not, and the space where it had been was smooth and empty, as if nothing had ever occupied it. The conquered fleet sensors recorded the event, and the data showed something that made Urath's stomach turn. The planet had not been destroyed. It had been erased. The rift did not consume matter the way a black hole did by crushing it into nothing, and instead it removed things from the timeline entirely and retroactively, and completely, so that they had never existed in the first place. The fleet's historical databases updated in real time, and suddenly, there were no records of Vareth Prime, and no records of the Torathi species, and no cultural archives, and no diplomatic files, and no entry in the conquered registry. 2 billion people had not died. They had never been born. The only reason anyone remembered them at all was because the fleet was positioned outside the rift's causal radius, and their memories had not been rewritten yet. And Urath understood with horrible clarity that if the rift continued to expand eventually, it would reach far enough that no one would remember anything it had taken. The Conquered was in full panic now, and 3 species had already begun emergency evacuation of their home systems, and the Council was in continuous session, and the debates had stopped being about strategy and had become about who would be saved and who would be left behind. Urath stood in his quarters aboard the Cassandra, and he stared at the empty patch of space where a world had been, and he felt something break inside him. He had spent his entire career in service to order and discipline, and the belief that the universe operated according to rules that could be understood and controlled. And now, he was watching reality itself come apart, and all the rules meant nothing. He sat down heavily, and he opened the ship's library terminal, and he did something he had never done before. He read a human book. He started with the Recursion Tide because it seemed relevant, and he read it in one sitting, and it was strange and clumsy in places, and the alien characters were clearly written by someone who had never met an alien, but the core of it was solid and real and frightening in its accuracy. And then he read another book and another. He read the old ones that Darius had mentioned, and the names were foreign to him. But the stories were not, because they all asked the same questions that Ureth was asking now. What happens when the universe turns hostile? And what do you do when the rules stop working? And how do you survive something you do not understand? The human answer was always the same. You imagine and you adapt, and you refuse to stop trying. Ureth read for 6 hours straight, and when he finally closed the terminal, he understood something about humans that 60 years of conquered membership had failed to teach anyone. Humans did not write fiction to escape reality. They owed it to rehearse reality. Every story was a practice run for catastrophe, and every novel was a dress rehearsal for the end of the world. And the reason humans could stand in the face of the impossible without breaking was because they had already faced it 1,000 times in their imaginations. They had been afraid before, and the fear had not stopped them. Because being afraid was something humans practiced too. The mission briefing was held in the Cassandra's main conference room, and every seat was full, and the air was tight with tension and purpose. Darius stood at the front, and he laid out the plan in simple terms. The Cassandra would fly into the rift carrying the counter-recursive signal, and the ship would need to reach the temporal epicenter, which was the point at the center of the anomaly where the time loops originated. And once there, they would activate the loop drive and create a paradox that would force the rift to collapse. The catch was that the crew would experience the rift's full recursive effect while inside. They would live the same moments over and over, and the simulations suggested they might cycle through thousands of loops before the paradox resolved, and each loop would feel completely real and completely new, and the psychological toll would be enormous. There was also the possibility that the loops would never resolve, and that the crew would be trapped in recursive time, forever repeating the same hours for eternity without even knowing they were repeating them. Darius said all of this clearly and without softening any of it, and when he was done he asked for volunteers. Every single human on the ship stepped forward. Not one hesitated. Ureth watched this happen, and he could not speak for a moment because he had served with soldiers his entire life, and he knew what courage looked like, and this was something beyond courage. This was familiarity. These humans were not brave in spite of their fear. They had read the stories, and they knew what the inside of a time loop looked like, and they knew what it felt like to face erasure, and they knew the weight of a sacrifice that no one would remember. They had imagined this moment 1,000 times before they ever lived it. Ureth found Darius in the corridor afterward, and he asked the question that had been building in him for days. How can you face something like this without breaking? Darius looked at him, and his expression was tired and warm and sad all at once. We have been reading about this our whole lives, he said, and every kid who ever stayed up past bedtime with a flashlight and a paperback was training for this. And they did not know it, and we did not know it, but that is what was happening. He smiled, and it was a small and human smile. We have been scared of the dark since we lived in caves, Commander, and we never stopped being scared, but somewhere along the way, we learned to write stories about what might be hiding in it, and those stories made us ready. Not unafraid. Ready. The Cassandra launched at dawn by Fleet Standard Time, and the crew stood at their stations, and the ship moved toward the rift with a steadiness that belied the terror of what lay ahead. Ureth watched from the bridge of the Axiom of Silence as the small human cruiser crossed the threshold and vanished into the swirling madness of broken time. Contact was lost immediately. The fleet waited. Hours passed and then days, and the rift continued to grow, and the sensors showed nothing from inside, and there was no signal and no transmission, and no sign that the Cassandra still existed. On the second day, the Torathi delegate, who no longer had a homeworld to represent, asked Ureth if he thought the humans were still alive. Ureth did not answer because he did not know. On the third day, the Salii ambassador began composing funeral rites for the Cassandra's crew, because her people believed that the dead should be mourned quickly, so their spirits would not wander. On the fourth day, Ureth stood alone on the observation deck and stared at the rift and tried to imagine what the humans were experiencing inside it, and he realized that he could not because his imagination had never been trained the way theirs had. And then on the fourth day at exactly the 17th hour by Fleet Standard Time, the rift shuddered. The movement was subtle at first, and the sensors almost missed it, but Ureth saw it on the screen, and he grabbed the edge of the console, and his breath stopped. The expansion halted. For the first time since the anomaly appeared, it stopped growing. And then slowly and impossibly, and beautifully it began to contract. Ureth opened a channel to the fleet, and his voice cracked with something that might have been relief, or might have been awe, or might have been the sound of a very old soldier learning something new. He said they did it. And across the fleet 42 species watched the wound in space begin to close. The rift collapsed over the course of 72 hours, and it was the most beautiful thing Ureth had ever seen. It folded inward like a flower closing at dusk, and the edges curled and softened, and the terrible light that had burned at its center dimmed from blinding white to amber to a faint violet glow that pulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then went dark. And as it closed, the things it had taken came back. Vareth Prime reappeared first, and the sensors showed it exactly where it had always been, with its green oceans, and its amber cities, and its 2 billion people going about their lives as if nothing had happened, because for them nothing had. The conquered databases updated again, and suddenly the Torathi files were restored, and the cultural archives were intact, and the diplomatic records were complete, and it was as if the erasure had never occurred. The Torathi delegate stood on the bridge of the nearest observation vessel and watched his homeworld shimmer back into existence, and he wept with a sound that needed no translation. 17 systems returned one by one, each one sliding back into the fabric of reality, like a word being written back into a sentence that had been left incomplete, and the galaxy was whole again. And then on the 73rd hour, a small battered ship emerged from the place where the rift had been. The Cassandra came out spinning and dark, with half its hull scorched, and its engines barely firing, and for a terrible moment the fleet thought it was a dead ship, drifting on momentum alone. But then the running lights flickered on one at a time, and a communication channel opened, and a voice came through, rough and exhausted and unmistakably human. "This is Captain Mwangi of the UENS Cassandra, requesting permission to dock, and also requesting a very large cup of coffee." The fleet erupted, and the channel was flooded with transmissions from every ship and every species, and the noise was joyful and chaotic and overwhelming. Ureth dispatched medical teams immediately, and he was the first senior officer to board the Cassandra after it docked, and what he found inside would stay with him forever. The crew was alive. All of them. But they were changed. Darius Mwangi stood at the center of the bridge, and his hair had gone completely white, and his eyes had the look of a man who had lived far longer than his body suggested. And when he saw Ureth, he smiled, and it was a tired smile but a real one. The medical teams swarmed the crew, and the initial assessments were staggering. The temporal loop drive had worked exactly as designed, and the Cassandra had cycled through an estimated 11,000 recursive loops inside the rift, and each loop had lasted approximately 45 minutes of subjective time. That meant the crew had experienced roughly 340 days inside the rift, compressed into 4 days of external time. Nearly a year of living the same hours over and over and over again. Some crew members showed signs of what the doctors called temporal bleed, and they would occasionally finish each other's sentences before they were spoken or react to events a half second before they happened, as if some part of their minds was still cycling through loops that had already ended. The doctors said it would fade. Probably. Darius sat in the medical bay while they examined him, and Ureth sat across from him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then Ureth asked what it was like inside. Darius stared at the wall for a moment, and when he answered his voice was quiet and careful, as if he was choosing each word from a very large and heavy collection. The first 100 loops were terrifying, he said, and we did not know if the drive would work, and we did not know if we would ever get out. And every time the loop reset it felt like dying and being born at the same time. He paused. The next 1,000 loops were worse because we started to remember, and we knew what was coming and we could not stop it, and some of us screamed, and some of us went quiet, and some of us laughed because there was nothing else to do. He looked at Ureth and his eyes were old. But somewhere around loop 4,000, something changed, and we stopped being afraid because we had been afraid so many times that the fear wore out like a muscle that had been worked past exhaustion, and what was left underneath was just us. Just people doing a job. And we kept doing it because that is what humans do, Commander, and we keep going. And it is not because we are not afraid, and it is not because we are special, and it is because we have told ourselves stories about people who kept going for so long that we do not know how to stop. The counter-recursive signal activated on loop 11,217, and the paradox resolved, and the rift began to collapse, and the loops ended, and the crew of the Cassandra sat in the sudden stillness of normal time and breath. The Conquered held a formal assembly 1 week later, and the Grand Conclave Chamber was full in a way it had never been before, because every species sent their highest representatives, and the session was broadcast to every inhabited system in conquered space. The High Speaker stood, and her silver scales gleamed under the ceremonial lights, and she spoke the words that changed humanity's place in the galaxy. For 60 years, she said, the human species has been a junior member of this Conquered, and we, the elder species, looked upon them with tolerance and perhaps with kindness, but not with understanding. We did not understand them because we did not know what we were looking at. She paused and her ancient eyes swept the chamber. Today we know. She announced that humanity was being offered a permanent seat on the High Council, not as a junior partner, but as a full strategic equal, and the vote was unanimous. And for the first time in the history of the Conquered, a species was elevated not for its technology or its military power or the age of its civilization, but for something that had no name in any alien language. The closest translation was imagination, but that word was not big enough. What the elder species had finally recognized was that imagination was not a luxury, and it was not entertainment, and it was not a weakness born of a short lifespan and an anxious mind. It was a survival mechanism. It was the most powerful survival mechanism in the galaxy, and humanity had been refining it for thousands of years, without even knowing what they were building. Ureth returned to the Velhari homeworld 1 month later, and he did something that no Velhari commander had ever done in the long, proud history of the Dominion. He requisitioned a complete copy of the Human Fiction Archives. He presented a formal proposal to the Dominion High Command, recommending that every Velhari officer be required to study human speculative fiction as part of their strategic training. His superiors were skeptical, and one of them, a very old admiral with campaign ribbons from wars that predated human civilization, asked Ureth why he would waste military resources on stories. Ureth stood at attention, and his forearms were folded behind his back, and his voice was steady. They did not defeat the rift with weapons, he said, and they did not defeat it with superior technology, and they did not defeat it with ancient wisdom or military might. They defeated it with a story that a young woman wrote in a small apartment 356 years ago, because she thought it would be interesting. He let that settle. If that does not terrify you, Admiral, then you are not paying attention. The Admiral approved the requisition. On the diplomatic station orbiting Concord, Prime Ambassador Lena Vasquez sat alone in her quarters, and the lights were dim, and a cup of tea was cooling on her desk. She was reading a novel. It was new and just published by a young human author who had never left Earth, and the story was about an alien signal that rewired the laws of physics inside a localized bubble, creating a pocket of space where cause and effect operated in reverse. It was a good story, and the science was interesting, and the characters were compelling, and the solution the author proposed was creative and elegant and almost certainly impossible. Almost. Lena set the book down and opened a secure file on her terminal, and she began typing. Contingency Plan Scenario 7441. She would finish it by morning, and then she would file it, and then she would pick up another novel because there was always another novel, and there was always another scenario, and humanity would keep imagining and keep writing and keep preparing for futures that might never come. And if one of those futures did come, then they would be ready. Because that was what humans did. The galaxy had spent millennia building empires of knowledge and stability and order, and all of it had nearly been undone by a single anomaly that no one had predicted. And humanity, the youngest and shortest-lived and most anxious species in the Concord, had saved them all because a young woman once asked what if and wrote down the answer. The galaxy had finally learned what humanity had always known. The future is not something you wait for. It is something you write first.